A racist nurse accuses a black woman of faking it, not realizing she's not only a doctor, but a member of the hospital's board of directors. Amara clenched her teeth, her face pale with pain, as she waited in the sterile, fluorescent-lit emergency room lobby. She could feel every pulse and twist in her abdomen, each throb sharper than the last. It was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, but as an experienced physician herself, she knew the signs and what her body was telling her. She needed immediate care. Still dressed in her professional attire, Amara looked out of place among the other patients in the crowded ER waiting room. But tonight, she was just another patient, a black woman in pain, waiting her turn like everyone else. Only her eyes gave away the severity of her situation as they darted around, searching for someone, anyone who might help. Finally, her name was called. She struggled to her feet, clutching her side as she approached the triage desk. Behind it sat Nurse Linda, her expression barely shifting from one of disinterest. Her eyes swept over Amara dismissively, as though sizing her up based on nothing more than her appearance. Amara Johnson? Linda's voice dripped with impatience as she scanned through her clipboard. "Follow me," she said curtly, barely making eye contact. Linda led Amara down a brightly lit hallway and into a small examination room, moving briskly as if her time was too precious to waste on someone like Amara. As Amara took a seat on the examination bed, she noticed how Linda was already standing with her arms crossed, looking at her with a judgmental smirk. "So, what seems to be the issue?" Linda asked, her tone cold and detached. She didn't reach for any instruments or take out a pen, just stood there, waiting, as if she couldn't spare more than a few seconds on her. Amara forced herself to take a deep breath before answering, trying to ignore the wave of nausea and pain sweeping over her. "I'm having intense abdominal pain on my right side. It started suddenly and feels severe. I think it could be." Linda cut her off with a skeptical raise of her brow. "Right, so it's just stomach pain? And now you're here in the ER. At this hour for that?" Amara felt a pang of frustration, but kept her tone calm. "It's more than that. The pain is acute, and I'm also feeling feverish. I'm concerned it might be appendicitis or another serious condition." She tried to remain factual, professional, despite the undercurrent of anger building up inside her. But Linda's dismissive gaze only hardened. "I see. Well, you don't look like you're in that much pain to me." Linda's voice dripped with sarcasm, and she gave Amara a once-over, her eyes settling critically on Amara's expression. "I'm going to be honest with you, honey. We get a lot of folks here just looking for attention, or even pain meds. You'd be amazed at the stories people make up." Amara stared at Linda in disbelief, her hand still pressed firmly over her aching side. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Linda said them, with a certain cruelty, as though she enjoyed undermining her. Amara had been on the other side of these conversations countless times, but she'd never spoken to a patient with anything but compassion and respect. This wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. "Listen, I'm a doctor," Amara said, her voice steady. "I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not here for attention or anything else. I know what serious symptoms look like, and I'm experiencing them." Linda's face twisted, an ugly, incredulous smirk appearing on her lips. "A doctor, huh? Sure. Everyone's a doctor when they come through these doors," she muttered with a sarcastic roll of her eyes. Amara felt a rush of anger and disbelief at Linda's blatant hostility, but she reminded herself to stay calm. She'd faced this kind of attitude before, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle prejudice, the doubting of her professionalism and credibility simply because of who she was. But the pain was making it difficult to keep her composure. She winced, feeling another sharp stab through her abdomen. "Look, I don't have time for this," Linda snapped, tapping her clipboard as if to remind Amara of how busy she was. "I have other patients to see, ones who might actually need help." The thinly veiled insult hung heavy in the air. Amara clenched her jaw but refused to let Linda see how deeply her words were cutting. She sat up straighter, fighting through the pain that was making her vision blur. "Could I see another nurse?" Amara asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the frustration mounting in her chest. "Or the attending physician?" Linda's eyes narrowed and her mouth twisted with a smugness that sent a chill down Amara's spine. "Oh, sweetie, you don't get to make demands here. You're lucky I'm even willing to waste my time checking you in. Now, if you're going to insist on this pain, I suppose I'll get someone to do an exam. But don't be surprised if nothing shows up." Amara felt the words cut through her, leaving a sting. This wasn't just a dismissive attitude, it was a denial of her dignity, her humanity. She gritted her teeth, mentally coaching herself to remain calm. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't going to let Linda's hostility deter her from getting the help she needed. Fine, Amara replied coldly, her eyes locking on Linda's with a resilience that momentarily took the nurse aback. I'll wait. Just let the doctor know I'm here. Linda gave a small, contemptuous shrug. Suit yourself. She made a show of scribbling a few lines on her clipboard before sauntering out of the room without a backward glance. The minutes dragged on, and Amara's pain grew worse. She clenched her fists, breathing through the sharp jabs of pain that now radiated across her lower abdomen. She'd been a physician long enough to recognize how her symptoms were worsening, and her anxiety grew. With every passing minute, she felt more certain that this was serious, potentially even life-threatening. After what felt like an eternity, Linda returned, holding a small packet of antacids. She dropped them onto the bedside table with a bored expression. Here, for your stomach ache. Amara blinked, incredulous. This isn't going to help. She managed, her voice low and even despite her frustration. I need a proper examination. Linda sighed theatrically. Look, I don't know what you're expecting here. You say you're a doctor? Well, you should know most of the time it's not that serious. A little stomach pain usually just goes away. Amara's patience was wearing thin, but the pain was becoming unbearable. She took a steadying breath. This is more than stomach pain. I've told you it feels like an emergency. Linda raised her eyebrows, looking as though she were thoroughly amused. If you say so, doctor. Her tone was patronizing, and her smirk was condescending. At that moment, another nurse peeked into the room. A young man with kind eyes who seemed concerned as he looked between Amara and Linda. Hey, Linda, the attending physician wanted to know if the patient here in room 3 had been seen yet? Linda rolled her eyes. She's just complaining of some stomach pain, maybe exaggerating for meds. I'll let them know she's fine. The young nurse looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as he glanced at Amara, clearly sensing the tension in the room. He hesitated for a moment, then asked, Ma'am, do you feel like you're getting worse? Amara looked him in the eyes, grateful for the compassion she saw there. Yes, I am getting worse, she answered honestly, and I need someone who can take my symptoms seriously. Linda snorted, interrupting. I've already been with her. If there was something real going on, I would have picked up on it. But the young nurse didn't back down. I'll inform the attending physician right away, he said, giving Amara a reassuring nod before leaving the room. Amara shot Linda a look that was a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Linda, however, seemed undeterred, her expression still smug as she continued to doubt and dismiss her. It's really a shame, Linda muttered as she looked over her clipboard. When people just want to waste our time with those over-the-top complaints, I get that you think it's serious, but we've got actual emergencies here. The comment lingered, cold and callous, echoing around the room. Amara couldn't believe the audacity, the complete lack of professionalism or empathy, especially from someone whose very job was to care for others. Just as Amara was about to respond, the attending physician walked in, a tall woman with a calm professional demeanor. She glanced at the chart Linda had filled out, her brows furrowing as she looked between Amara and the notes scribbled in a dismissive, almost mocking tone. Amara Johnson? The physician asked, looking directly at her. I'm Dr. Fields. Let's take a look at you. Amara nodded, relief flooding her as she finally met someone who seemed willing to listen. The attending doctor conducted a thorough examination, taking note of Amara's symptoms, her visible discomfort, and the cold sweat that had broken out across her forehead. As Dr. Fields gently examined her abdomen, pressing down in various spots to determine the source of the pain, Amara could sense the doctor's concern. The attending physician's face grew increasingly serious as she continued the assessment, her eyes flicking back to Amara's pained expression with genuine empathy. I'm going to order a CT scan and some blood work, Dr. Fields said firmly, her voice filled with urgency. She glanced briefly at Linda, whose face had turned from smug indifference to faint unease, as though she was realizing she might have missed something significant. Thank you, Dr. Fields, Amara murmured, her voice weak with relief. But Linda rolled her eyes, shifting uncomfortably as she muttered, I really don't think that's necessary. She just seemed a bit dramatic. You know how some people can get. Dr. Fields shot Linda a sharp look that could have cut glass. Linda, the patient's symptoms indicate a potentially serious condition. And I don't care for judgments on whether her pain is real or not. She's here in my ER. We'll treat her with professionalism and respect. Linda's face flushed, but she didn't respond. Her attitude had shifted, but the resentment in her eyes remained as she grudgingly exited the room, her heels clicking in a staccato rhythm down the hallway. The young nurse from earlier returned to escort Amara to radiology, his face kind and reassuring. As they navigated the hospital's winding halls, the young nurse spoke quietly. "I'm really sorry for what happened back there. It shouldn't have gone that way." Amara nodded, grateful but exhausted. "Thank you for stepping in. Sometimes it takes just one person to do the right thing." He smiled, casting her an encouraging look before they arrived at radiology. Amara held back a wince as the technician prepared her for the CT scan, grateful for the chance to finally get answers. She lay back as the machine hummed around her, focusing on steadying her breath and keeping her mind clear. It was strange to be on this side of the examination table. She treated patients for years, yet now she was the one hoping for a swift diagnosis. Back in the examination room, as she awaited the results, Amara's thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Fields returned, her face even graver than before. She took a seat beside Amara, her eyes serious but caring. "Amara," she said, her tone soft but professional. "Your scan and blood work indicate that you have an inflamed appendix, and it's looking like it may rupture soon. You're going to need emergency surgery." Amara nodded, her expression calm despite the alarming news. The confirmation brought her a strange sense of relief, knowing her pain was validated and that help was on its way. But the calmness was interrupted by the heavy sense of injustice over what had just transpired with Linda. If she hadn't insisted, who knows how long she would have been left waiting, potentially jeopardizing her life. Dr. Fields must have sensed the frustration in Amara's expression because she looked at her sympathetically. "I understand. This should have been addressed right away. I'll be speaking with the head of nursing about this incident," she said, her voice firm. "It's unacceptable." Amara nodded slowly. As satisfying as it was to hear someone else acknowledge the wrong done to her, she wasn't finished yet. She knew she held a unique position of authority here, and she planned to use it. After the surgery was scheduled, Amara was prepped and wheeled into the operating room without further delay. The procedure went smoothly, and the surgical team handled her care with skill and compassion. Hours later, she awoke in a recovery room. Groggy but relieved that the worst of her ordeal was over, she felt the fog of anesthesia gradually lift, leaving her more alert. A day passed in recovery, during which various hospital staff came to check on her. Surprisingly, Linda was not among them. When the young nurse from the night before stopped by, Amara gave him a faint smile and motioned for him to come closer. "I was wondering, do you know where Nurse Linda is?" she asked casually. The young nurse's eyes shifted awkwardly. "She's on duty today, but I think Dr. Fields might have spoken to her about yesterday's incident," he replied, sounding hesitant. Amara nodded. It was what she'd expected. She knew Dr. Fields wouldn't take the nurse's behavior lightly, but she wasn't certain if anything substantial would come from it. Amara had dealt with systemic biases long enough to know how easily certain behaviors could be brushed aside. But Linda's actions had gone beyond simple prejudice. Her treatment had actively put Amara's life at risk. Later that afternoon, after her pain had subsided and she'd regained some energy, Amara decided it was time to put things into motion. She reached for her phone, typing a quick message to a senior colleague on the board of directors, explaining her situation with succinct professionalism. Within the hour, she received a response, and soon enough, a request for an internal review had been submitted. As a well-respected physician with a reputation for advocating for patients' rights and high standards of care, Amara's complaint carried weight, and as someone who held a prominent position on the hospital's board, her voice was one that couldn't easily be ignored. She knew that once the board investigated, Linda's behavior wouldn't just be overlooked. The following morning, Amara awoke to find that Dr. Fields had arranged for an early discharge. She was tired and sore, but determined to see things through. As she gathered her things, she heard a knock on her door. Dr. Fields entered, accompanied by another nurse who carried her discharge papers. "I'm glad to see you're doing well," Dr. Fields said warmly, her demeanor professional, but carrying a hint of a smile. "I'm sorry that your experience here began on such a rough note." Amara nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Dr. Fields. Your intervention made all the difference." Dr. Fields hesitated, then continued. "The hospital is already looking into the issues you raised. The board and HR are taking your concerns seriously. If you need anything else from us, you know how to reach me." Amara smiled, grateful for Dr. Fields' professionalism and diligence. "I do. Thank you for handling everything so promptly." Amara was just about to leave the hospital when, rounding the corner near the main lobby, she spotted Linda at the nurse's station. Linda's face flushed the moment she saw Amara, and her posture shifted from confident to awkwardly rigid. The usually haughty expression on her face was replaced by a look of embarrassment and a hint of fear. Linda shifted uneasily as Amara approached her. Oh, Miss Johnson, she stammered, her voice lacking its usual smugness. How, how are you feeling? Amara met her gaze with an unwavering stare, her eyes sharp. Dr. Johnson, actually, she corrected calmly, and I'm feeling much better, thanks to the doctors who provided me with the care I needed. Linda's face went pale, her mouth opening slightly as the realization hit her. Doctor, you're a doctor? She echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, I'm also a member of this hospital's board of directors, Amara replied smoothly, watching as Linda's face fell even further. I didn't realize, Linda stammered, visibly shaken now. Her face twisted with an uncomfortable blend of embarrassment and disbelief. She looked as though she wanted to say something, to defend herself or apologize, but the words stuck in her throat. I would hope that it wouldn't matter, Amara continued, her tone polite but cutting. I would hope that any patient who comes through these doors would receive the same level of respect and care, but clearly that's not what happened here. Linda's gaze dropped to the floor, her bravado completely shattered. She seemed to struggle with her words, attempting to grasp for something to salvage her dignity. I didn't mean, I didn't know. Amara raised an eyebrow. Didn't know what? That I was in pain? That I was human? Or that I was someone who could hold you accountable? Linda was silent, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form a response. There's an investigation underway now, Amara continued, and I'm sure that once they review the accounts from that night, they'll find everything they need to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. With that, Amara turned and walked away, leaving Linda standing there, her face ashen and her hands trembling at her sides. Amara didn't wait for her to respond. She didn't need to. She knew that justice would follow in due course and the system would take care of the rest. As Amara exited the hospital, the fresh air hit her face, and she felt a profound sense of relief. The experience had shaken her, but she knew that by speaking up, she'd taken a stand not just for herself, but for every patient who might come after her, for every individual who might find themselves vulnerable in a system that sometimes failed those it was meant to protect. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past days lift slightly. Though she was a doctor and board member, she knew that her role as an advocate for others was what mattered most. And from that day on, she'd carry this experience with her as a reminder of the work still left to be done. She knew she'd done the right thing, and as she walked out, Amara felt a powerful surge of resolve. There would be change, and that was only the beginning. The board meeting was called only days after Amara filed her complaint. Given her position and the severity of the charges, the board prioritized a swift and thorough investigation. Amara was prepared, though the recent surgery left her still a bit sore. She sat at the head of the table in a private meeting room, reviewing the report in her hand. It was thorough, compiled with accounts from staff, patient testimonials, and detailed hospital policies outlining standards of care that Linda had blatantly disregarded. The other board members filed in, many casting supportive nods and glances her way. Dr. Fields, who had initiated her own formal complaint, entered with a stack of notes, determined to see justice done. Moments later, Linda walked in, escorted by a member of HR. Gone was her confident swagger. Instead, her face was drawn and her posture slumped like a student called into the principal's office. She gave a fleeting look toward Amara, but quickly looked down when their eyes met, her face flushing with embarrassment. The severity of the situation was written in every tense line of her face. Amara watched as Linda took her seat, her hands twisting nervously. Linda had always been able to dismiss people like Amara, until now. Amara's calm, composed expression showed no sign of yielding. The meeting opened with the procedural review of the events surrounding Amara's ER visit, followed by a reading of the complaints Dr. Fields and other staff had filed. Each point highlighted Linda's blatant neglect, her dismissive attitude, and the discriminatory undertones of her comments. When the chair finally invited Amara to share her account, she spoke with precision, recounting the pain, the fear, and the disregard Linda had shown her as a patient. Linda's behavior was more than just unprofessional, Amara said, her tone steely. It was dangerous and deeply prejudiced. Her dismissal of my pain as dramatic wasn't just an insult, it was an active threat to my life. The board listened intently, some looking disturbed, others visibly angry. Amara continued, emphasizing that the way she'd been treated wasn't just about a personal grudge, but rather symptomatic of biases that had no place in a hospital. She concluded with a firm statement. I'm here today not just to seek justice for myself, but to ensure that no patient ever has to experience what I did. Finally, the chair turned to Linda, inviting her to respond. Linda's face was red with a mix of shame and anger. She stumbled over her words, clearly shaken. I I made a mistake. I didn't realize who Dr. Johnson was, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I was just tired. I thought she was exaggerating. Amara raised an eyebrow, and the chair interjected sharply. So you're saying the level of care you provide depends on a patient's title? Or if you think they're exaggerating? Linda paled, her eyes darting around the room. No, that's not what I meant. I thought she was overreacting. I didn't mean any harm. But harm is precisely what you caused, Dr. Fields interrupted, her voice cold. You put a patient's life at risk because you judged her. Based on what exactly? You dismissed her without ever checking her records or performing a proper evaluation. Linda's hands clenched around her notepad, her fingers turning white. She looked like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Her usual bravado was nowhere to be found. The board chair leaned forward. Ms. Linda, the investigation has revealed a consistent pattern of neglect and biased behavior. Your treatment of Dr. Johnson was discriminatory, plain and simple. We can't allow staff members who bring personal biases into patient care. Linda's voice broke as she tried to muster one last plea. Please, I can explain. I didn't mean it that way. I didn't realize. Her words trailed off, replaced by a silence that spoke volumes. The HR representative announced the board's unanimous decision. Effective immediately, Linda was suspended pending further investigation, with the high likelihood of termination. The board made it clear they had zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior, particularly in matters of life and death. The silence that followed was heavy as Linda's shoulders slumped. The consequences of her actions were finally settling in, and there was no escape. Her eyes flicked to Amara, filled with something that could have been remorse, or perhaps just the fear of repercussions. Amara didn't look away. She met Linda's gaze with unwavering strength, her own sense of justice firmly intact. As the meeting adjourned, the other board members thanked Amara for her bravery in coming forward. Dr. Fields approached her afterward, offering a warm handshake. You did the right thing, she said, her voice full of respect. We're lucky to have someone like you on the board, someone who isn't afraid to hold others accountable. Amara smiled, grateful for the support. I appreciate that, Dr. Fields, but really I just want to make sure that every patient, regardless of who they are, receives the care they deserve. The hospital's internal newsletter published a statement later that week, emphasizing their renewed commitment to equality and compassion in patient care. Amara's complaint had led to a new policy initiative, introducing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all hospital staff. The hospital administration made it clear every patient would be treated with respect, regardless of background, ethnicity, or perceived status. Weeks later, fully recovered and back in her office, Amara received a letter from a former patient of Linda's who had heard about the investigation. The patient, a young black woman, shared a story eerily similar to Amara's, detailing a night when she had come to the ER in severe pain, only to be dismissed by Linda and sent home with a casual recommendation for over-the-counter painkillers. This patient had ended up back in the hospital the next day, her condition worsened and requiring emergency treatment. Amara closed the letter, her heart heavy but resolved. She knew now that speaking up hadn't just been the right choice. It had been necessary. In the end, Amara's courage didn't only bring justice for herself, it sparked a much-needed change within the hospital system, ensuring that no other patient would be dismissed or treated as less than simply because of bias. As for Linda, she was dismissed from her role, her record permanently marked by her actions that night. Unable to find work in similar positions, she faced the lasting consequences of her prejudice. Amara knew it was a harsh outcome, but she also knew it was just. She'd faced down an injustice not just for herself, but for all who might come after. And as she sat in her office, knowing she'd left a mark on the system for the better, she felt an immense sense of peace. Justice had been served, and her fight had made a difference.